The summer of 1683 began with whispers of doom carried on the winds that swept across the Hungarian plains. In the courts of Europe, diplomats spoke in hushed tones of an army so vast that it darkened the horizon like a living storm. Merchants returning from Constantinople described military preparations unprecedented in scale, weapons forged by the thousands, grain requisitioned from a dozen provinces, war horses gathered from breeding grounds across the empire. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed IV, had unleashed his Grand Vizier with a singular command: take Vienna or die trying. Kara Mustafa Pasha was not a man who accepted failure. Risen from humble origins to become the second most powerful person in the Ottoman Empire, he had clawed his way to the Grand Vizierate through a combination of military prowess, political cunning, and strategic marriages into the imperial family. Now in his 50s, corpulent but still energetic, he dreamed of surpassing even the legendary Suleiman the Magnificent. If he could capture Vienna, the golden apple that had eluded Ottoman armies for over a century, his name would echo through eternity. Before we continue this journey into one of Europe's darkest and most extraordinary hours, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And if this is your first time on our channel, subscribe now. Because what you're about to hear is a story that official history tried to bury, but memory refused to forget. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had pushed westward, swallowing kingdoms whole and planting the crescent moon banner across territories that had once prayed beneath church spires. Constantinople fell in 1453, transforming the Byzantine capital into Istanbul. The Balkans submitted. Hungary became a battleground, then a vassal. Now, at the zenith of their power, the Ottomans sought the ultimate prize, the Habsburg capital, the city that guarded the gateway to Germany, Italy, and the heart of Western civilization itself. Emperor Leopold, the friend of the Holy Roman Empire, understood what was coming. A cultured man more interested in music than warfare, Leopold had spent his reign navigating the treacherous politics of European courts, while the Ottoman threat loomed ever larger on his southeastern frontier. Intelligence reports from spies embedded within Ottoman territories painted a terrifying picture. Kara Mustafa had assembled between 150,000 and 200,000 soldiers, including the elite Janissaries, slave soldiers raised from childhood to know nothing but war and absolute loyalty to the Sultan. Behind the Janissaries marched Sipahi cavalry, feudal warriors granted land in exchange for military service. Artillery crews dragged massive siege cannons through mountain passes, weapons capable of reducing the thickest walls to rubble. Engineers who had breached the fortifications of 100 cities carried scaling ladders, tunneling equipment, and the specialized knowledge of bringing death from below ground. And trailing behind this vast military machine came camp followers numbering in the tens of thousands, sutlers, servants, and slaves who formed a mobile city of their own. Vienna's garrison numbered barely 15,000 men. The city's medieval walls, though reinforced over centuries with angular bastions and outer earthworks, had never faced a siege of this magnitude. As spring turned to summer, Leopold made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He fled Vienna with his court, leaving his subjects to face the Ottoman tide alone. The emperor's carriage disappeared westward on July 7th, and with it went the last hope of many Viennese citizens that their ruler might share their fate. But not everyone abandoned the city. Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a battle-hardened veteran with iron-gray hair and eyes that had witnessed more carnage than any man should endure, assumed command of Vienna's defense. At 55 years old, Starhemberg had fought Turks, French, and rebels across 3 decades. Wounds scarred his body like a map of European conflicts. Standing atop the Stephansdom Cathedral on July 13th, watching the Ottoman vanguard appear on the southern horizon, like a dark tide flowing across the plain, he made a vow that would echo through history. Vienna would not fall while he still drew breath. On July 14th, 1683, the Ottoman army completed its encirclement of Vienna. From the city walls, defenders watched in horrified fascination as the enemy established their camp. A tent city that stretched for miles in every direction. Colorful pavilions sprouted like exotic flowers across the landscape, their silk canopies shimmering in the summer heat. At the camp's center rose the magnificent tent of Kara Mustafa himself, a structure of legendary opulence rumored to be furnished with carpets, tapestries, and golden vessels worth more than entire European villages. The Grand Vizier had chosen his strategy with cunning precision. rather than launch costly direct assaults against Vienna's formidable bastions, mistakes that had doomed previous Ottoman sieges. He would let his engineers do the deadly work. Ottoman sappers, recognized as the finest siege specialists in the world, began digging a network of trenches and tunnels toward the city walls. Working under the cover of night and protected by wicker screens during daylight, they inched closer each day while remaining largely safe from defensive fire. These tunnels served a dual purpose, advancing assault troops to the very base of the walls and placing explosive mines beneath key fortifications. The Ottomans had perfected this technique over centuries of siege warfare. Massive quantities of gunpowder would be packed into chambers carved beneath enemy walls, then detonated to create breaches through which storming parties could pour. It was methodical, patient, and devastatingly effective. Vienna's defenders could do little but listen to the ominous sounds of digging beneath their feet and pray. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg organized the defense with methodical precision born of long experience. He divided the walls into sectors, assigned experienced commanders to each, and established a system of reserves that could rush to any threatened point within minutes. Civilians, men, women, even children, were pressed into service-building secondary fortifications behind the main walls, carrying ammunition to gun positions and tending the steadily growing number of wounded. The city's bakers worked through the night to keep the garrison fed, their ovens glowing like beacons of defiance. Blacksmiths hammered out replacement weapons, their forges ringing with the sound of resistance. The first major Ottoman mine exploded on July 23 beneath the Berg Bastion, one of the key defensive positions guarding the approach to the imperial palace. The detonation was apocalyptic, a column of earth, stone, and human bodies erupting skyward, the concussion wave shattering windows throughout the city center. When the dust cleared, a breach 30 feet wide gaped in the wall, rubble still smoking from the explosion's heat. Janissaries surged forward with their characteristic war cry, "Allah! Allah!" scaling the rubble with ladders and grappling hooks, scimitars gleaming in the summer sun. For 3 horrifying hours, hand-to-hand combat raged in the gap. Men died by the hundreds, their blood turning the debris slick and treacherous. Starhemberg himself led a counterattack, his sword slashing through the press of bodies, rallying exhausted defenders with the sheer force of his presence. By nightfall, the breach was sealed with makeshift barricades, and Ottoman bodies carpeted the approaches. Vienna had survived, this time. That night, as Vienna's defenders counted their dead and tended their wounded, Starhemberg ordered rockets fired into the sky from the cathedral tower. Brilliant bursts of color against the darkness, signals to any relief force that might be watching. Far to the north in the Polish city of Krakow, a king was indeed watching. Jan III. Sobieski had received Emperor Leopold's desperate plea for aid, and though Poland and Austria had been rivals for generations, Sobieski understood a fundamental truth. If Vienna fell, Warsaw would be next. He began gathering his forces for a march that would change the course of history. Days blurred into an endless nightmare of bombardment and assault. The Ottomans probed Vienna's defenses constantly, testing for weakness, wearing down the garrison through sheer exhaustion. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford. The moment a man closed his eyes, the drums would beat, the cannons would roar, and another attack would materialize from the smoke. Starhemberg rotated his men as best he could, but there were simply too few defenders and too much wall to protect. Days blurred into weeks of unrelenting horror. The Ottoman bombardment never ceased. Cannons thundered at all hours of day and night, their iron balls smashing through rooftops, demolishing churches, turning cobblestone streets into graveyards of rubble. The defenders learned to distinguish between different types of incoming fire. The deep boom of siege mortars lobbing explosive shells, the sharper crack of culverins firing directly at the walls, the whoosh of incendiary projectiles designed to set the city ablaze. By early August, Vienna had become a charnel house. The beautiful Baroque city that had once hosted brilliant composers and dazzled visitors with its sophistication transformed into a nightmare landscape of destruction. The stench of death hung over everything, rotting corpses in the streets that burial parties couldn't collect fast enough, gangrenous wounds in overcrowded hospitals, the sweet-sick odor of plague victims being burned in mass pyres outside the cathedral. Disease spread through the crowded population, as summer heat turned the dead into breeding grounds for pestilence. Water supplies dwindled as the Ottoman siege lines cut off access to springs outside the walls. Food grew scarce. First, the fresh meat disappeared, then the grain reserves began running low. Starhemberg ordered strict rationing, but hunger gnawed at defender and civilian alike. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Rats became a delicacy. Children searched through rubble for anything edible, their hollow eyes haunting the adults who could do nothing to help them. And still the mines kept exploding. Every few days another section of wall would erupt in fire and thunder, opening a new wound in Vienna's defenses. Each breach brought another desperate battle, another mountain of corpses, another miracle of survival that felt more like postponed doom. The Lobel Bastion took 3 direct mine explosions and somehow held. The Berg Bastion was breached twice more and twice more sealed with blood and courage. The outer Ravelin, an earthwork defensive position, fell completely, forcing the defenders back to the main wall. Starhemberg walked the walls each morning, his presence alone sometimes enough to stiffen the resolve of men stretched beyond human endurance. He had been wounded 3 times already. A saber cut across his left arm that still seeped through bandages, shrapnel embedded in his thigh that sent fire through his leg with every step, a musket ball that had grazed his temple and left him half deaf in one ear. Yet he refused to rest, refused to show weakness, understanding that if the men saw their commander falter, the city's spirit would shatter like glass. The women of Vienna emerged as unlikely heroes during those desperate weeks. When men fell at the walls, their wives and daughters took up their weapons and their posts. Maria Renata Silbermann organized teams of women to pour boiling water and heated sand on attackers attempting to scale the breaches, a gruesome but effective defense that the Ottomans had not anticipated. Helena Kurtzman, a baker's widow with arms like oak branches from years of kneading dough, led a group that discovered an Ottoman tunnel entrance inside the city. They attacked with whatever weapons they had, kitchen knives, hatchets, boiling oil, killing 7 sappers before the passage could be collapsed. Children too young to fight served as runners, carrying messages and ammunition through streets swept by sniper fire. Old men who could barely lift a sword stood guard duty through the night, freeing younger soldiers for the brutal work at the walls. The entire population of Vienna had become an army, united by the simple understanding that surrender meant death or slavery, and that their only hope lay in holding out until help arrived, if help was coming at all. Outside the walls, Kara Mustafa grew impatient with the siege's slow progress. His engineers reported that the main defensive wall, the Lobel Bastion, was nearly undermined, its foundations honeycombed with tunnels packed with gunpowder. One more massive explosion would create a breach impossible to defend. The Grand Vizier ordered the final mine prepared, scheduled to detonate on September 12th. He sent word to his subordinate commanders that they should prepare their men for the final assault. Vienna's treasures, its gold, its women, its churches to be converted into mosques, would soon be his to distribute among the faithful. But Kara Mustafa had made a fatal miscalculation. So confident was he in the eventual fall of Vienna that he had neglected to fortify his rear against relief forces. His scouts reported distant dust clouds to the northwest, perhaps just Austrian refugees fleeing the coming conquest. He dismissed these warnings with a wave of his jeweled hand. The Christians were too divided, too weak, too frightened to assemble a relief force capable of challenging his magnificent army. It was a decision born of arrogance, and it would cost him everything. King Jan III. Sobieski of Poland was not a man given to hesitation. At 54 years old, he had spent 3 decades fighting Tatars, Cossacks, and Ottomans along Poland's vulnerable southern frontier. His body bore the scars of countless battles, a crooked nose broken by a Turkish mace at the Battle of Podhaice, a limp from a lance wound that never fully healed, hands calloused and scarred from a lifetime gripping sword and rein. Where other European monarchs spent their days in palatial comfort, Sobieski had lived much of his life in military camps, sharing the hardships of his soldiers. When Emperor Leopold's messenger arrived in Krakow begging for aid, Sobieski saw not just a Christian duty but an opportunity for glory that might never come again. The Ottoman Empire at the gates of Vienna. If he could break this siege, his name would rank with the legendary defenders of Christendom. More practically, he understood that a victorious Ottoman army would not stop at the Austrian border. Poland, weakened by decades of internal conflict, could not survive alone against such power. Better to fight the Turks at Vienna than wait for them to arrive at Warsaw. On August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, The Polish army departed Kraków after attending Mass at the Wawel Cathedral. Sobieski had assembled 27,000 men, a formidable force that represented nearly all of Poland's military strength. But the true terror of this army was not its size, but its cavalry, specifically the legendary winged hussars. These elite warriors had dominated Eastern European battlefields for 2 centuries, their charges breaking armies that outnumbered them 10 to 1. The hussars rode massive war horses bred specifically for the demands of heavy cavalry warfare, animals standing over 16 hands tall, powerful enough to carry armored riders at full gallop for sustained distances. Their weapons included 18-foot lances called kopia that could pierce armor at charging speed, sabers of legendary sharpness, and war hammers for crushing helmets and skulls. But most distinctive were the wooden frames attached to their backs, fitted with eagle, ostrich, or swan feathers that created an otherworldly whistling sound as they charged. The purpose of these wings has been debated by historians. Some argue they were purely ceremonial, others that the sound intimidated enemy horses, still others that the frames protected riders from rear attacks. Whatever their practical function, their psychological impact was undeniable. The sight of the hussars in full charge, thousands of winged warriors thundering forward in perfect formation, their feathers screaming through the air, had broken enemy formations before a single blow was struck. Ottoman soldiers who had faced them called them the Devil's Horsemen. The march to Vienna covered over 200 miles through difficult terrain. Sobieski drove his men relentlessly, knowing that each day of delay brought Vienna closer to destruction. They forded swollen rivers, struggled through mountain passes, pushed exhausted horses beyond their limits. Stragglers were left behind. Equipment was abandoned. The king himself, despite his age and wounds, rode at the head of the column, his example shaming any man who thought to complain. They crossed the Danube on September 6th and began ascending the Kahlenberg mountain range that overlooked Vienna. Here they joined forces with Imperial German troops under Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, and contingents from Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, and Swabia. The relief army now numbered approximately 70,000 men, formidable, but still significantly smaller than the Ottoman host below. Yet spirits were high. For the first time in months, Vienna's defenders would not fight alone. On the night of September 11th, the Allied commanders gathered in the Camaldolese monastery atop the Kahlenberg for a council of war. Candles flickered across maps spread on rough wooden tables as generals argued over strategy in a babble of German, Polish, Latin, and Italian. The monastery's white-robed monks moved silently among them, offering wine and bread to men who might not live to see another sunset. Some commanders favored a cautious approach, probe the Ottoman flanks, force Kara Mustafa to divert troops from the siege, wait for the enemy to weaken further from disease and desertion. The Germans particularly advocated patience, pointing out that a failed relief attempt would doom Vienna more certainly than continued waiting. But Sobieski had seen the signal rockets fired from the Stephansdom. He knew what those desperate flares meant. The city could not survive another week, perhaps not another day. "Gentlemen," the Polish king declared, his voice cutting through the debate, "tomorrow we attack with everything we have. We strike at dawn, infantry on the left and center, cavalry on the right when the moment is ripe. There will be no probing, no skirmishing. We go for the heart." He slammed his fist on the map, directly over Kara Mustafa's camp. "One blow, one day. Vienna will be free or we will all be dead. There is no middle ground." The Duke of Lorraine, a veteran of countless campaigns who had been fighting Ottomans since his youth, studied Sobieski with calculating eyes. He could object. Technically, as commander of the imperial forces, he outranked this Polish king. But he recognized the fire in Sobieski's gaze, the absolute certainty of a man who had spent his life in similar desperate moments. "Very well," Lorraine said finally. "We attack at dawn. May God be with us all." Outside the walls of Vienna, Kara Mustafa received reports of the relief army's arrival with dangerous complacency. His engineers assured him that the final mine beneath the Lobel bastion would be ready to detonate on September 12th. One more explosion, one final assault, and the city would fall. The Christian relief force was of concern, certainly, but his army still outnumbered them significantly. Let them attack. His janissaries would hold them off while the siege was completed. By sunset tomorrow, Vienna's treasures would be his. It was a fatal miscalculation born of arrogance. So confident was the Grand Vizier in Vienna's inevitable fall that he had neglected to fortify his rear. His army's dispositions remained oriented toward the city walls, not toward the mountains from which death was descending. Trenches faced the wrong direction. Artillery was positioned to bombard the city, not to repel cavalry. The greatest Ottoman army ever assembled had left its back exposed to the largest cavalry force Europe had ever gathered. As midnight approached on September 11, 1683, priests moved through the assembled Christian ranks offering final blessings and absolution. Men confessed sins they had carried for decades, made peace with their God, and prepared their souls for whatever dawn would bring. Sobieski himself attended Mass in the monastery chapel, kneeling before the altar in full armor, his feathered wings casting strange shadows in the candlelight. Outside, 70,000 men lay under the stars, trying to sleep before the day that would decide the fate of a continent. The morning of September 12th broke gray and misty over the Vienna woods, the first hint of autumn cool mixing with lingering summer warmth. From his command position on the Kahlenberg Heights, Sobieski surveyed the battlefield spread before him like a living map painted in browns and greens, and the distant gleam of the Danube. The Ottoman camp sprawled across the plain below, a chaotic maze of trenches, artillery positions, tent cities, and siege works that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Smoke rose from 1,000 cooking fires. In the distance, Vienna's battered walls still flew the Habsburg double eagle, though the flag was tattered and the walls themselves crumbling. At 4 a.m., before the sun had fully risen, the Allied infantry began their descent from the mountains. The German and Austrian forces attacked first, moving through vineyards and terraced farmland toward the Ottoman left flank. It was brutal, bloody work from the first moment, fighting through villages where every stone wall became a fortress, every vineyard a killing ground. Musket fire crackled across the morning air. Smoke drifted through orchards. Men screamed, fell, died, while their comrades stepped over their bodies and pressed forward. The Ottoman defenders, though caught off guard by the scale of the assault, fought with the discipline of professional soldiers. Janissary units formed firing lines that raked the advancing Germans with devastating volleys. Sipahi cavalry launched counterattacks that threatened to roll up the Allied flanks. For hours, the battle hung in balance, neither side able to gain decisive advantage. The September sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist to reveal the full scope of the carnage. Bodies scattered across fields, wounded men crawling toward any available shelter, riderless horses galloping in terror. Kara Mustafa had awakened to catastrophe, but responded with something less than the urgency the situation demanded. For precious hours he dithered, sending reinforcements to one sector, then recalling them, ordering assaults on the Vienna walls even as his army was being attacked from behind. His subordinates begged him to wheel the entire army to face Sobieski's forces, but the Grand Vizier seemed paralyzed by the impossibility of abandoning the siege that had consumed months of effort. This indecision would prove fatal. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg had watched the Allied army descend from the mountains with tears streaming down his grimy, powder-blackened face. After 60 days of hell, help had finally arrived, but he understood the battle was far from won. The garrison was down to its last reserves of powder and shot. The final Ottoman mine was scheduled to explode that very day, and if the relief force failed, Vienna would fall before sunset. He ordered every man capable of standing to the walls. Even the wounded dragged themselves from hospital beds, determined to fight to the last breath if necessary. This was the final hour. By early afternoon, the Allied infantry had pushed the Ottomans back across a 3-mile front, but at terrible cost. The slopes below the Kahlenberg were carpeted with dead and dying men in the uniforms of a dozen nations. Turkish artillery had found its range and was tearing gaps in the German formations. The center was holding, barely, but there was no breakthrough, no shattering of enemy morale that might turn retreat into rout. Sobieski watched from the heights, patient despite the screaming urgency, waiting for the moment when the enemy lines would waver. At 5 p.m., as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western hills, that moment arrived. What happened next would become the largest cavalry charge in recorded history, a moment so extraordinary that even witnesses struggled to describe it in their memoirs. King John III. Sobieski raised his saber, its blade catching the afternoon sun, and 18,000 horsemen began moving forward from the Kahlenberg Heights. Polish hussars occupied the center. their winged frames creating a forest of feathers against the sky. German and Austrian cavalry formed up on the flanks. The descent had begun. The initial movement was almost leisurely. The slopes were steep and treacherous, and cavalry charging downhill risked catastrophic falls that could break formations and kill horses. The riders picked their way carefully through vineyard terraces and rocky outcroppings, maintaining the tight formations that would be essential for the devastating impact to come. But as they reached level ground, the pace increased. Walk became trot. Trot became canter. Canter became gallop. 18,000 horses began to thunder across the plain. The winged hussars led the charge. 3,000 of Poland's finest warriors thundered forward in a wedge formation, their 18-foot lances leveled at the enemy, aimed directly at the heart of the Ottoman camp. The feathered wings attached to their armor began to whistle, that terrible, otherworldly sound that had haunted Ottoman nightmares for generations. It was said that horses hearing that sound for the first time would panic, that hardened soldiers would break and run before a blow was struck. Today, tens of thousands would learn the truth of those stories. Behind the hussars came wave after wave of Allied cavalry, German reiters with their wheel-lock pistols, Austrian cuirassiers in gleaming breastplates, lighter Polish cavalry and Cossack auxiliaries. The mass of horsemen stretched across the plain like a steel flood, their hoofbeats creating a rumble that could be felt in the bones. Dust rose in enormous clouds that partially obscured the charge, adding to the apocalyptic atmosphere. From Vienna's walls, the garrison watched in amazement. Many fell to their knees in prayer, convinced they were witnessing divine intervention. The Ottoman soldiers who first saw the charge coming had perhaps 30 seconds to prepare, 30 seconds that stretched into eternity as their worst nightmares materialized before their eyes. Those feathered wings, that terrible sound, the wall of horses and steel bearing down with inexorable force. Some units attempted to form defensive squares. Others fired ragged volleys that dropped horses and men, but could not slow the avalanche. Most simply turned and ran, throwing away weapons, trampling comrades, desperate to escape the death that screamed toward them. The hussars struck the Ottoman lines at full gallop. The impact was catastrophic. Their copia lances punched through armor, shields, flesh, and bone with terrible efficiency. Men were lifted from their feet by the force of the blows, hurled backward like rag dolls. Horses crashed through infantry formations, their weight alone crushing soldiers beneath iron-shod hooves. The first rank of defenders simply ceased to exist, replaced by a chaos of screaming horses, falling bodies, and blood that sprayed through the afternoon air like red rain. Once their lances shattered or became too embedded in corpses to withdraw, the hussars dropped them and drew their famous sabers, curved blades of Hungarian steel, sharp enough to slice through a silk scarf dropped on the edge. They laid about them with devastating efficiency, carving paths through the panicking Ottoman ranks. Behind them, the rest of the Allied cavalry poured through the gaps, widening the breach, turning local collapse into general rout. The Ottoman army, the greatest military force the empire had ever assembled, was breaking apart. Sobieski himself rode into the melee, his royal standard flying above the chaos. A king leading from the front was not unusual in Polish tradition. Sobieski had done it dozens of times before, but the symbolic power of his presence electrified the Allied troops. Where the king rode, men found strength they didn't know they possessed. Where his banner flew, enemy formations crumbled. He was 60 years old, his body aching from old wounds and hard riding, but in that hour he was the angel of death incarnate, and the Ottomans fled before him like sheep before a wolf. Kara Mustafa watched his army disintegrate from his command tent. The silk pavilion that had cost more than a small kingdom stood surrounded by chaos, panicking soldiers streaming past in every direction, officers screaming contradictory orders, the wounded crawling through the dust begging for help that would never come. His janissaries, the elite troops who had never known defeat in living memory, were being ridden down like untrained peasant conscripts. The invincible Ottoman war machine had become a terrified mob. The Grand Vizier had perhaps 10 minutes to make the most important decision of his life. He could stay and die, rally whatever troops remained loyal, make a stand at his tent, go down fighting in a last gesture of defiance. It would be the honorable choice, the warrior's choice. Or he could flee, preserve his life, and face the Sultan's judgment. Both options led to death, he knew. Mehmed IV did not forgive failure of this magnitude. But flight offered at least the possibility of explanation, of deflecting blame. of one final gamble. He chose flight. Abandoning his treasure-laden tent, his artillery, his siege equipment, and his dreams of conquest, Kara Mustafa mounted a horse and joined the stream of fugitives flowing southeast toward Hungary. Behind him, the Allied cavalry swept through the Ottoman camp like the wrath of God, cutting down anyone too slow to escape. Servants, camp followers, wounded soldiers, all fell beneath flashing sabers. The pursuit would continue for miles, the killing only ending when exhausted horses could no longer run. What remained in the abandoned camp staggered belief. Sobieski himself rode through as the darkness fell, marveling at the wealth left behind like offerings to a victorious god. Gold coins were scattered across the ground like autumn leaves, soldiers' pay that would never be collected. Silk carpets worth fortunes lay trampled in the mud. In Kara Mustafa's abandoned tent, the Polish king found the Grand Vizier's personal treasure, chests of jewels, golden vessels, priceless weapons inlaid with gems, and most precious of all, the holy banner of the Prophet, a sacred relic that the Grand Vizier had carried from Constantinople to bless the conquest of Vienna. Sobieski sent this banner to Pope Innocent V as a gift, physical proof of Christianity's deliverance. With it, he sent a message that would echo through history. Veni, vidi, Deus vicit. I came, I saw, God conquered. The words deliberately echoed Caesar's famous boast, but with divine credit replacing human pride. The king understood that what had happened this day transcended ordinary military victory. The largest cavalry charge ever mounted had broken the greatest Ottoman army ever assembled. Vienna was saved. Europe was saved. An empire's expansion had reached its high water mark and begun to recede. Inside Vienna, the garrison had watched the cavalry charge from the walls, straining their eyes through smoke and dust to follow its progress. When they saw the Ottoman tide break and flee, when they understood that the impossible had happened, grown men wept openly, falling to their knees in thanksgiving. Church bells that had been silent for weeks began to ring, first one, then another, then all of them, until the entire city echoed with the sound of salvation. Starhemberg, who had held Vienna through 60 days of hell through sheer force of will, finally allowed himself to collapse. He had been awake for nearly 3 days straight, running on nothing but determination, and the knowledge that his city needed him. Now, at last, he could rest. The human cost of the siege and battle was staggering, a butcher's bill that took weeks to fully calculate. Vienna had lost approximately 5,000 soldiers and an unknown number of civilians. Some estimates suggest as many as 20,000 died from combat, disease, and starvation during those terrible 60 days. Entire families were erased, their homes reduced to rubble, their names forgotten by history. The survivors emerged from cellars and shelters like ghosts, hollow-eyed and disbelieving, wandering through streets they barely recognized. The Allied relief force suffered around 4,500 casualties in the single day of battle, a relatively light toll for so decisive a victory, but still representing thousands of families who would never see fathers, sons, and brothers return home. German, Austrian, Polish, Bavarian, Saxon. The dead came from across Christian Europe, united in death as they had been in battle. Mass graves were dug in the Vienna woods, where the bodies of the fallen still lie centuries later. Ottoman losses were catastrophic beyond anything the empire had experienced in generations. Between 15,000 and 20,000 soldiers died in the battle alone, with thousands more perishing during the chaotic retreat as pursuing cavalry and vengeful peasants cut down stragglers. Disease and starvation claimed additional thousands during the long march back to Ottoman territory. Of the 150,000 men Kara Mustafa had led to Vienna, barely half would return home. Bodies carpeted the plain outside Vienna's walls, so numerous that burial parties worked for weeks. Kara Mustafa Pasha retreated to Belgrade with the shattered remnants of his army, knowing that failure of this magnitude demanded punishment. Sultan Mehmed IV had entrusted him with the greatest military force in Ottoman history, and he had lost it all in a single afternoon. The Grand Vizier spent his final weeks attempting to rebuild his forces and deflect blame onto subordinates, executing several generals as scapegoats. But everyone understood that such catastrophic defeat required a scapegoat of the highest rank. On December 25, 1683, Christmas Day in the Christian calendar, the Sultan's executioners arrived in Belgrade. They carried with them the traditional silk cord used to strangle officials who had fallen from imperial favor. Kara Mustafa was permitted to perform his final prayers. Then the cord was placed around his neck. According to witnesses, he faced death with dignity, offering no pleas or excuses. His head was removed and sent to Constantinople, where it was displayed at the palace gates as a warning to others who might fail the empire. The man who had dreamed of surpassing Suleiman the Magnificent had become a cautionary tale. Among the more unusual spoils of victory were hundreds of sacks of strange dark beans found in the Ottoman camp, coffee largely unknown in Austria at the time. A Polish merchant and sometimes spy named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, who had served as a messenger during the siege, claimed these beans as his reward. He opened Vienna's first coffee house, the Blue Bottle, introducing the city to a drink that would become synonymous with Viennese culture. The café traditions that would later nurture Freud, Mahler, Klimt, and countless other artists and intellectuals were born from the detritus of Ottoman defeat. The croissant, too, may owe its existence to this victory. Legend holds that Viennese bakers created the crescent-shaped pastry to celebrate the Ottoman defeat, the shape mocking the crescent of the Islamic banner. Whether true or merely a pleasant myth, the story captures the cultural impact of September 12, 1683. A moment of existential crisis had become the foundation for traditions that would spread across the Western world. The victory also had profound military implications that would shape European warfare for the next century. The devastating effectiveness of the Hussar charge demonstrated that heavy cavalry, properly trained and boldly led, remained a decisive force on the battlefield even in an age of gunpowder. European armies rushed to develop their own heavy cavalry units, leading to the golden age of mounted warfare that would last until the Napoleonic era. The defeat at Vienna marked the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's long decline, a slow collapse that would take 2 centuries to complete, but which was, in retrospect, irreversible from September 12, 1683. For the next 16 years, the Holy League, an alliance of Austria, Poland, Venice, and eventually Russia, pushed the Ottomans back across Hungary and the Balkans. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formalized these losses, the first time in Ottoman history that the empire had been forced to cede significant European territory. The dream of conquering Europe that had driven Ottoman policy for 3 centuries died on the slopes of the Kahlenberg. Jan Sobieski returned to Poland a hero, celebrated throughout Europe as the savior of Christendom. Pope Innocent XVII called him the champion of the Christian world. But his triumph at Vienna would be the high point of his reign, and in some ways, of Polish history itself. He spent his remaining years fighting the nobility, who resented his fame and struggling to secure the throne for his sons. When he died in 1696, Poland elected a Saxon as their next king, beginning a period of foreign domination that would eventually see the nation partitioned completely out of existence. The savior of Europe could not save his own kingdom from internal decay. Starhemberg lived until 1701, honored as Vienna's greatest defender, his portrait hanging in places of prominence throughout the city. But the siege had broken something essential in him. He walked with a permanent limp, heard poorly from the musket ball that had grazed his temple, and suffered constant pain from shrapnel never fully removed from his body. Friends described a man who had given everything in those 60 days and had nothing left to give afterward. Yet he never complained, considering these afflictions small prices for having saved a city and perhaps a civilization. Today, visitors to Vienna can still trace the outlines of the 1683 siege. The Turkenschanz Park, literally Turkish Trenches Park, occupies ground where Ottoman sappers once dug toward the city walls. The Stephansdom Cathedral, whose south tower served as Starhemberg's command post and signal station, still dominates the skyline as it did when desperate defenders fired rockets from its heights. In the Vienna Military Museum, you can see artifacts of the siege, weapons, armor, and the tent of Kara Mustafa himself, captured on that September evening when everything changed. In Poland, Sobieski remains a national hero, his cavalry charge commemorated in paintings, songs, monuments, and the national memory. Every September 12th, historical reenactors gather to recreate the charge, their feathered costumes echoing the winged warriors who once decided the fate of a continent. The Jasna Gora Monastery, where Sobieski prayed before departing for Vienna, displays relics of the campaign like sacred objects, tangible connections to a moment when Polish arms wrote themselves into the annals of world history. The Battle of Vienna also demonstrated the power of unity against existential threat. For one brief moment, the squabbling kingdoms of Europe, Catholic and Protestant, rivals and enemies, set aside their differences to face a common foe. Poles fought alongside Germans, Bavarians alongside Saxons, all under the unifying banner of Christendom. It was perhaps the last time that religious identity could mobilize such cooperation across the continent, a final echo of the crusading spirit before nationalism became Europe's dominant organizing principle. Historians have debated for centuries what would have happened if Vienna had fallen. The most likely scenario suggests that Kara Mustafa would have continued his advance into Germany, where no comparable fortress stood between Vienna and the Rhine. The fragmented German states, still recovering from the devastation of the 30 Years' War, could not have mounted coordinated resistance. By winter, Ottoman armies might have reached the borders of France. The scientific revolution and enlightenment that transformed Western thought in the following century might have unfolded very differently, or not at all. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of 1683 is the reminder that history is not inevitable. On September 11th, Vienna's fall seemed certain. The garrison was exhausted, the walls crumbling, the final mine about to explode. One more day, perhaps one more hour, and there would have been nothing for Sobieski to save. The margin between catastrophe and deliverance was measured in moments, in the decisions of a handful of individuals who chose to fight rather than surrender, to march rather than hesitate, to charge rather than retreat. This is the true lesson of Vienna, that civilization is always fragile, always dependent on those willing to defend it. Starhemberg holding his shattered walls through impossible weeks of fire and death. Sobieski driving his cavalry through mountain passes to arrive in the nick of time. The nameless women of Vienna pouring boiling water on attackers from the breach walls. Children carrying ammunition through streets swept by sniper fire. The wounded dragging themselves from hospital beds for one final stand. These ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, chose courage over despair, and thereby changed the world. When the winged hussars crested the Kahlenberg on that September afternoon, their feathers screaming through the air, they carried with them not just Polish lances, but the accumulated weight of European civilization. Behind them lay centuries of cathedrals and universities, of art and philosophy, of scientific inquiry and political evolution. Before them lay an army that threatened to sweep all of it away. And in that thundering charge, in those few minutes of terrible violence, the future was decided. Europe would survive. The Enlightenment would dawn. The modern world, with all its complexities and contradictions, would be born. All because 18,000 knights rode down a mountainside into the largest cavalry charge in history, and an empire broke against them like waves against a cliff. Vienna still stands. Coffee still pours in its legendary cafes, and the wings of the hussars still echo through time. A reminder that darkness can always be turned back, if only enough people are willing to ride into it.